Hello, welcome to Conway Hall. We hope you're all well out there, and thanks for joining us. We have a record audience with us today. Before we introduce our speaker, I want to say thank you, welcome. If you're not familiar with Conway Hall, we are named after the famous American and slavery abolitionist Monsieur Conway, who came and helped sort of I should have rehearsed this before I started. He helped found the first humanist chapel in London, and Conway Hall, which was built from that, is named after him. We've been running regular Sunday talks for a long time to promote ideas of ethical thought and making the world a better place. And it's really great that we're continuing to do this through the COVID-19 crisis. It is our charitable mission to continue to do this, and if you haven't donated to this event, do please go to the link that we'll be sharing at the end of the talk and give us some sort of donation just to help us carry on putting on talks like this. Alice Procter, who's about to give the talk, was first booked for April, but we were just switching over into the internet world, and so her talk was postponed. But really happy to be welcoming Emma back here to talk on a subject that was relevant then, but is now even higher in the public consciousness now. So we're really happy to be hosting her. Alice is a tour guide, a podcaster, author of a book about colonialism and art in museums, and she is with us right now. So please welcome Alice Procter. Thanks, Alice. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. Hi everyone, I've had a look through the names and I can see some familiar faces, which is really lovely. And I am really excited that you're all here. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that I do and hopefully try and make this relevant to current discussions about monuments and commemoration and things like that. So I have some images to share. If we have any technical difficulties, I'm also going to try and send these images around so you can see them as well. But I want to just get going, if that's all right, and we're going to have some time at the end for questions. I'm really glad that we've managed to reschedule this from April. However, it is extremely weird to be sitting in my kitchen to do a lecture. So please bear with that and be patient about that. And we're going to get going. So, I'm an educator and tour guide primarily. I've been running a project called Uncomfortable Art Tours since summer 2017. So my tours are now 3 years old. And the idea of creating these tours was to go into museum spaces and art galleries and talk about objects that were on display, but that I felt weren't really being addressed in their full contexts. My background is as an art historian. And so although I'm interested in the material histories of these works, I'm mostly interested in their sort of social and political transformations over time. I do a lot of work thinking about how we tell stories in museums, and I decided to use tour guiding as a format because it's an opportunity to bring an audience into a gallery space, use the objects on display, use the things that are actually within this institution as a way of understanding the history of that collection and how it's been created. I want to give some context to my work before we really start. And one of the things that I think is useful for that is to give you a sense of the kind of framing that I use in my work. I see myself and describe myself as doing a process of object-led storytelling. So the idea is that we're working with these objects, we're working with these physical things, and we're using them to connect to different stories, bigger histories, different ways of understanding the world. One of the slogans that I use a lot in my work is display it like you stole it, which is this idea of taking something that is an object with a contested history, perhaps, is a euphemistic way of putting it, but objects that have violent provenance and stories of looting and theft and acquisition through conquest and invasion and that sort of thing, and trying to make that story present in the way that the museum is then representing the object. So you might recognize some of the pieces that I use for these stickers. And they include the Bend and Bronzes, which is in the British Museum, which is taken as part of a military expedition by the British in the 1890s and end up in European museums. The Parthenon sculptures from Athens is probably the most famous contested object in a British collection. There's also Tipu's tiger, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and is one of the objects that I talk about on my tours there, as it relates to the creation of Orientalism and fantasies of savagery and power, particularly in Britain's creation of colonial India. Sometimes in this talk, I'm going to refer to terms that are historically accurate in the way that people used them at the time. I want to do it with the caveat of making it clear that I'm not condoning the language that I'm using. I'm going to be very specific in the terms that I'm using. I also want to make sure that everyone's aware of and comfortable, well, okay with the fact that there are going to be references to deceased people, particularly people from Indigenous Australian backgrounds. So if that's a cultural concern for you, please consider this a warning. And there will be some discussion of acts of violence and racially motivated murders. I'm not showing any images of those acts, but we're going to sort of talk around them as a way of understanding what museums are doing right now. The fourth object down here is an Australian object that's taken by Captain Cook on his arrival in what is now Australia. And it represents a kind of moment of colonial invasion and encounter. So these are some of the different types of stories that I try and tell in my work. I also really want to encourage visitors to think about these things for themselves. It's not just about putting the responsibility onto museums to correct the stories that they're telling and improving their labels, although that is something that I believe museums have a responsibility to do. I'm also trying to teach audiences to find these stories and engage with them in a more critical way. So one of the things that I hope people can come away from my tours with is a sense of a sort of toolkit of how to engage with stories, particularly ones that have a colonial history that audiences might not be familiar with. It's very difficult sometimes to go into a museum space and feel confident enough to ask questions about colonialism and imperialism, especially if that's not a space that you are encouraged to feel welcome. So when we were originally going to do this talk in April, it was going to be much more of a general discussion about the history of museums, and it was going to be sort of a book launch for me. A lot has changed, obviously, since then. And one of the things that I really want to focus on today is how we commemorate histories of violence. So there's a lot of discussion right now about statues and monuments of imperialist figures, slave traders, colonial governors, and figures that are involved in histories of incredible and traumatic violence. I'm guessing some of you are probably aware of the way that this conversation's played out, particularly around the idea that statues should be removed and placed in museums. I don't think that's a good outcome for a number of reasons that we're going to get into. And most significantly, I hope I can show you with this talk some of the problems that museums have, and the way that museums are also part of this history of misrepresentation. I believe that art galleries and historical institutions have just as much work to do as some of the more obvious cases of banks or businesses that are connected to slave ownership or are founded in that way. I don't think that museums are ready to perform this role of being the sort of perfect keepers of history in the way that we often put pressure on them to be, particularly when we talk about the idea of take down a statue and put it in a gallery so that the museum can contextualize it. Museums are already failing to do that with the collections that they hold right now. So adding half a dozen statues of slave traders isn't going to make that job any easier for them. One of the things that I want to show you today is some of the ways that artists are responding to these histories. So there are a couple of cases of artists who are using museum collections as the kind of basis for their work. And hopefully that's a slightly more optimistic way of thinking about these stories. It's a way of encouraging people to take creative action for themselves, not to be passive and wait for the museums to take charge, but to find an alternative way of representing and telling these stories. Obviously, I have no idea when it's going to be okay to go back to museums and reopen those spaces. And so probably a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today will be obsolete by the time that we get to go back into art galleries. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that's still, there's still value in thinking about these things and having these conversations, but I'm too much of a historian to try and predict the future of how we're going to deal with these objects. So with that caveat, I'm going to launch into it. Some of you may have seen this headline when it came out in September last year. It was quite an interesting case because the Amsterdam Museum decided to change the way that it referred to some of the galleries and collections that it held. We had this history previously of the museum referring to itself as having a kind of golden age. If you're familiar with Dutch history, we often use this term when we're sort of talking about the 17th and 18th centuries as this period of trade and expansion and colonialism. And the idea of a golden age is something that for a lot of people conjures incredible wealth, incredible cultural prosperity and success and power and all of those things. The museum stopped using the term because they felt that it didn't actually accurately represent that era. Obviously, whenever you have a kind of golden age historically, you also have people that are suffering to provide that kind of gilding. And in this case, the Dutch history is connected to the invasion and colonization of significant parts of the world, the enslavement and sale of African people into the transatlantic slave trade, the creation of the kind of racially unequal and incredibly violent power dynamics and histories that we see then going on throughout the 18th and into the 19th and 20th centuries. The other problem with the Golden Age is that as a term that's sort of used as a catch-all, it doesn't actually give us very much information. When you hear a term like Golden Age, you often sort of just tune it out because it's not a very meaningful phrase. You know the sorts of things that it's supposed to conjure for you, but it doesn't actually encourage you to spend any more time thinking about those things. It's too easy to see a term like this. I think an English equivalent is really when we refer to the idea of an age of enlightenment. And that's something that we particularly see in the UK with the idea of the British Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment as well as part of that history. It's a phrase that gets thrown around because it sounds really big and significant, but it's actually quite sort of linguistically meaningless. In this case, the museum wasn't erasing anything from their history. They were changing the way that they told those stories and encouraging people to think about it more deeply. There was a significant amount of backlash to this. There was a lot of discussions about the idea that people really liked the term Golden Age and it made people feel sort of positive and good about their history. My response to that is that history isn't supposed to make you feel good. It's supposed to tell you the truth about things. So I want to start with this idea just as something to keep in mind as we keep talking, that histories and the way that we tell them, it's political in the language that we're using, as well as the objects and the stories that we're centering. In a case like this one, what we're seeing is a museum attempting to correct the mistakes that it has historically made. It's not perfect, but it's a start towards changing the way that these stories are being framed within the institution. Similarly, another piece of context to have in mind is the way that images and objects connected to histories of violence and particularly to histories of enslavement are held by institutions. So in this case, Tamara Lanier brought a court case against Harvard University because Harvard owned the copyright to images of her great-grandparents who had been enslaved. These are some very famous images, and if you look up this court case, you'll see the photos and you'll probably recognize some of them. They're frequently used as book covers or in exhibitions and that sort of thing. And Harvard was profiting off this because people were buying the licensing rights to these images. Lanier showed that she was the descendant of these people and tried to persuade the university to give her some compensation to turn over the photographs and to ensure that they stopped continuing to profit from enslaved lives. There are other cases that are similar to this. A lot of museums, a lot of art galleries, even when they have contested objects in their collections, they profit from the lending of those objects. They profit from people asking to use photographs of those objects for lectures or books or exhibitions and things like that. And so we have to keep in mind that this is beyond just who physically holds the object. It's also about the legal structures and the political frameworks that created these institutions and are continuing to support them and shore them up. Related to that, there's been work in a number of institutions trying to find ways of telling stories of colonialism and violence in the labels that they use in their galleries. So the Worcester Art Museum in Massachusetts added extra panels to their galleries as a way of including more information without taking away what was already there. This was quite an exciting project. They got a lot of attention for it 2 years ago, and it's completely disappeared now. I've spent a lot of time recently trying to find traces of this project in the gallery's archives, and you can't find it, you can't search it. All of these paintings and all of this research is still held by the museum, but it's no longer on display and it's no longer publicly available. To me, this is a really typical example of what a lot of museums will do. They will have one researcher, in this case, one curator, who really stepped up and led this project. And then if that individual leaves the institution, all of the knowledge goes with them. There's no sense of longevity to a lot of these projects. And it's seen as a kind of temporary intervention that's supposed to help visitors understand things in greater depth. But if you're not in the gallery on the day that it's there, it's very hard to find these things going forward. Arguably the most famous example of a museum intervention along these lines is a project by Fred Wilson that was done in the 1990s called Mining the Museum. If you're at all connected to art history or museum studies, you're almost certainly familiar with this piece. It's become very iconic, and it's still the example that people pull out as sort of the greatest and most perfect and most archetypal museum intervention. What Wilson did was take objects that were already part of the collection at the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore and put them on display. So in this case, he took the metalwork display, which was showing these very beautiful, very elaborate silverware pieces that were part of the museum's collection, and he included in that cabinet a set of slave shackles. This photograph is not the best quality because it's from the 90s and I've got sort of photos of scans of photographs, so it's not great quality, but hopefully you can see the way that he's introducing this object into the bigger cabinet. It's the dark metal shackles down the bottom that are Wilson's intervention. If you look up Mining the Museum, you can find out a lot more about this project, and you'll see the way that it is continually being wheeled out as the sort of greatest and best example of this type of museum intervention. This exhibition is older than I am. It's not new anymore. It's not fresh or exciting or modern anymore. It was this very kind of cutting edge, turning point type of show at the time, but the fact that we still haven't surpassed it, to me, speaks to the way that so many museums are willing to rest on the fact that they did one progressive thing once, or did one exciting show or intervention or exhibition, and had just become quite complacent in the aftermath of that. You can find the catalogs and the images of Mining the Museum, but if you go to the actual museum, now the Maryland Historical Society, the displays have gone back to the way that they were before. This isn't still standing, it's not sort of surviving. And it was presented as an art piece rather than a transformation into the museum's own history. It was a kind of sculptural exhibition that Wilson was commissioned to create, which gets at the way that these institutions are often very reluctant to confront change. Wilson is, and Mining the Museum as well, is very much a sort of artist's artwork in that so many people still reference it and celebrate it. And I think it's fantastic. I do really appreciate this piece. But the fact that it's still kind of the best example that we have is something I find deeply frustrating. On a similar theme to Wilson's piece, this is a photograph from an installation by the Indigenous Australian artist Daniel Boyd. So this was a commissioned work that he created for the Natural History Museum in London in 2011-2012. He did an artist residency there, responding to collections of Indigenous Australian human remains that are still held by the museum. Need some water, sorry. So Boyd's work is called Up in Smoke. What he did was, at the time that he was resident in the museum, the curators and keepers of the collection were re-archiving large parts of the material that they held, particularly the human remains. Boyd managed to get hold of the deaccessioned storage boxes that had been used to store human remains and bone fragments and things like that. So on one side of this image, you can see the piles of boxes. These had previously been used to hold human body parts and ancestral remains. On the other side, he uses the lids of the new boxes as the canvas for his images. And I've got more images of these to show you now. But just to give you a sense of what he's working with, Boyd's own family history was connected to these objects in the museum. In the course of his research at the Natural History Museum, Daniel Boyd was able to identify the remains of an individual from his nation, from his family background and his cultural group in Australia. So he describes having this very intense, very kind of overwhelming experience of finding his ancestor within the museum collections. This is something that carries a huge amount of emotional weight and emotional kind of depth and heaviness and significance to it. And it's important to recognize that these are pieces that were being treated by the museum as archival materials, but to another person were the relics of an ancestor. So you can see here the type of archive boxes that the museum was using. These are used to store skulls in them, which is part of the remains that Boyd identified as being from his family. And they show you the types of ways that these objects were held by the museum. And these are the images that he creates in the lid. So he uses resin and pigment to imitate the style of the kind of very widely known, almost cliched Indigenous Australian dot paintings that are very, very widely recognized as associated with the Desert School of Artistic work. This is a portrait of a man called Pumulwuy. Pumulwuy was an Indigenous resistance leader in the early years of the colony of what's now New South Wales and Sydney. And he was a significant figure in that history as the leader of armed rebellions and armed resistance to the European invasion. Pumulwuy was killed by British officers or possibly by a gardener. The details are very unclear around his death. But we do know that after his death, his head was removed, his head was preserved, and it was sent to a museum in London. It was sent to the Hunterian Museum via Joseph Banks, who's also very heavily involved in the creation of European colonies in Australia. Pumulwuy's head goes on display in the Hunterian Museum. And from that moment on, we don't know where it ends up. It's lost to the archives, essentially. We never really see it again. We don't know if it survives, if it's destroyed at some point. So Pumulwuy's remains are out there somewhere, and there's an opportunity to try and find and identify those remains. But it's also a symbolic thing about the way that this leader and this kind of head figure of resistance becomes a trophy for the European collectors. This is a portrait of Joseph Banks, where he's shown alongside his collections, and he's shown as the sort of perfect Enlightenment gentleman with all of his accumulated treasures from traveling in the Pacific. And Daniel Boyd repaints this image, showing Banks as a pirate. He also includes a portrait of himself as a head in a jar. So this is a reference to his ancestors' remains in the museum, to Pumulwuy and Pumulwuy's kind of representation, the desecration of his remains, and Banks's involvement in that process. Boyd is referring to the fact that his ancestors are part of his lineage here. This is part of the history that he has inherited. And these images are intended to be kind of funny on one level. You know, Joseph Banks is a pirate, there's some humor to that. They also carry this kind of darker weight of trying to find a way of commemorating these figures. I want to be very clear that when we talk about museums and the work that they do, we're also thinking beyond just the collections that they hold. If you saw the Oceania exhibition at the Royal Academy last year, there were some very beautiful objects in it. There was some significant work done in that exhibition to collaborate with Indigenous communities and people that were connected to the objects on display, but there were also problems with that show. Not everyone was consulted equally or equitably. Many people did not have their stories accurately represented by the gallery labels. When you went into the gift shop at the end of the exhibition, they had toy soldiers of Maori warriors. It's important to put this in the context of the way that the remains and body parts of Maori people were collected as trophies by British soldiers in the 18th and into the 19th centuries. There's a history of a trade in body parts that's running in the background of this. When you have people turned into sort of kitschy souvenirs and trophies that are then on display in a museum shop, that's part of how we understand these objects as well. It's really important that we recognize the ways that the commercial stories surrounding these objects also have an impact on the art historical works that are on display. We can see a brilliant exhibition. It can be very beautifully and carefully curated. And then if you step into the gift shop and see something like this, that immediately undermines the humanity and the dignity of the stories that you've just seen, that's going to affect your experience and your sort of memory of the event. following on from that, I want to show you some images from an art installation by Attia called The Museum of Emotion. So these are photographs of a piece within that show that was called The Repair from Occident to Extra-Occidental Cultures. Firstly, it's really great to note that he's using the idea of the Occident as opposed to the Orient. He's really centering this on the idea of Western culture as something that's created and fantasized, as opposed to the more traditional way that we would understand Orientalism as exotic and unfamiliar. And within this exhibition, what Attia was doing was creating essentially an archive of responses to trauma. So many of the images and objects that he creates within this display refer to traditional anthropology museums, anthropology collections, and that sort of thing. He uses museum cabinets as a way of grounding it in this kind of aesthetic. Within the display, what Attia is doing is drawing our attention to the different understandings of scars and healing. So within this exhibition, he's including images that show how deliberate body modification, deliberate sort of physical transformation is an object of celebration and pride in many non-European and non-Western cultures. This is something that's treated as a kind of trophy of endurance, of dignity, of community. Scarring is something that's understood in a very culturally specific way. In the West and European cultures, we're often used to this way of thinking about wounds as something that must be healed and covered up and concealed and hidden. Whereas other cultures and other traditions celebrate the idea of scarification or the recovery from injury as a way of marking transitions within the body, within kind of your culture and your role in society. There's something here to think about in terms of how we understand history and the marks that history leaves behind. There's a very strong tendency in Europe, particularly in Britain, to treat history as something that's closed and closed off and complete. Particularly when we talk about imperialism, it's often done in this way that presents the history of the British Empire as something that's always happening elsewhere. It's always at a distance. And this is a really important thing to try and unpick. The legacies and tangents and threads and consequences of colonialism are felt by everyone to varying degrees. The history of the British slave trade is just as present in the UK as it is anywhere else in the world. And histories of genocide and imperialism reflect back on the people that perpetrate those acts, as well as leaving a trauma behind for the survivors. There's a sense in which we need to understand these histories as mutable. They're moving in multiple directions. It's not a sort of power dynamic that's binary. It's very flexible, it's very fluid, and it's constantly in motion. The way that we think about commemoration in this country and in this context is often around the idea that once an event is over, it's sealed, and we can put up a statue or put up a monument and never forget that this thing happened. But when we talk about the idea of never forgetting, what we're also doing is insisting that it's entirely past, it's entirely closed off. You can't forget something that you're still living with. So when we talk about this idea of, we must remember, we must never forget something, what that often implies is the idea that nobody is actually living with the consequences of these events and these actions. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently in terms of how we deal with statues and monuments. I want to be very clear, first off, that I'm fully in favor of removing statues of racists, and I think it's great. I think it's very, very overdue in many cases. But with that in mind, we need to talk about what we do when those objects are missing. As a culture, people in the UK are not really prepared, for the most part, to deal with what happens when you take that statue down. And there's this very strong sense that when you have these monuments standing, you're sort of outsourcing the work of commemoration to a physical object, rather than having to carry that within yourself and deal with the consequences within yourself. You have to attempt to unravel the colonialism within your own understandings of history, as well as undoing the way that it's presented in museums and school curricula and things like that. I found this installation very beautiful when I saw it at the Hayward Gallery because of the way that it sort of celebrated the idea of a scar, not only in the sense that it's the thing that we carry with us that reminds us of an event, but also the idea that in its endurance, a scar shows us the care and the work that's been done to attempt to heal. It's not necessarily a kind of gruesome and bloody thing, scars and the marks that they leave behind are the evidence and the relics that show someone cared for us, someone helped us through that healing process. There's something very moving in that, and something very promising to me about the ways that we can learn to understand history as always leaving a mark, always leaving some kind of barrier and some kind of trace behind. When we think about, when we use this kind of metaphor of the wound, it's important to remember that often the deepest wounds don't leave a surface mark, and they're the most dangerous ones because you don't know how to treat them, because you don't see their physical form. When you try and hide the idea of this kind of inherited trauma and this inherited violence, what you're doing is just allowing it to fester and allowing the bone to stay broken, or whatever metaphor you prefer here. To kind of continue on this theme of statues, this is the statue of Roosevelt that's outside the American Museum of Natural History in New York. So this is one of the statues that's currently up for debate. It's been controversial for an extremely long time because it shows the figure on the horse is Theodore Roosevelt, and to either side it shows caricatured figures representing the Native American type, not a specific nation or cultural background or history, but a generic embodiment of an indigenous North American person. And on the other side, it shows a kind of caricatured embodiment of a Black African person. Again, no specificity, no cultural kind of context or grounding, but just the archetypes of these two groups as the attendants and sort of followers, essentially, of Roosevelt, who's the figure that's leading the group. There's a lot of really fascinating work about this statue. I would really recommend that you look it up and find out more about the way that it's been understood and presented. I can recommend some articles if that's something that you want, but there's a lot of really great information about the way that Roosevelt's representation in this statue also relates to a history of eugenics and the idea of white supremacy within the hierarchies of this physical art object. I saw this statue about 6 months ago, and one of the things that was very striking about it was the ways that the museum are attempting to refigure and recontextualize it. As it stands, there was a corridor space in the museum. It was this tiny, tiny, tiny gallery that had some information about the history of the statue and included video clips of a random group of New Yorkers and visitors to the museum who've been asked to comment on what they thought of the statue. It felt to me, being in this space, like the first 5 minutes of a project of contextualizing this statue, rather than a complete reconsideration and attempt to engage with these and tell these stories. When the discussion kicked off recently over whether the statue should be removed, someone suggested moving it into the gallery space. And again, I want to emphasize this is a corridor. It's sort of 2 meters wide at the most. And there's absolutely no way you could fit this statue into that space, which speaks of the disconnect between museum trustees that were suggesting this and the actual physical space of the gallery. It's worth spending some time with an object like this one because of the baggage that it carries. This is a fundamentally incredibly racist, incredibly violent object. It's been the subject of intervention and transformation by groups, including led by groups like Decolonize This Place, which is an incredible collective organization. But what it speaks to is the ways that we're so familiar with the iconography of racism and imperialism and white supremacy that we stop even noticing when those things are present in many cases. Thinking about the idea of what's left behind after we remove these statues, I am kind of, for the most part, in favor of the idea of including new forms of memorialization in those spaces, trying to recontextualize and reframe the object wherever possible. But in some cases, I believe that the statue just needs to come down and disappear. And this is one of those cases. I don't think there's any value in preserving this physical object. We have images, we have its history, we don't need to keep the thing. I would probably say the same about the Colston statue, actually, although I have some other thoughts on that I can get into if you want to when we've got questions. But for now, I want to be very clear that I believe that many of these objects have to go. They cannot be rehabilitated. There's no room for bringing them into the museum and reframing them, because in this case, the museum is already trying and failing to do that reframing. One of the most famous displays and spaces within the Natural History Museum in New York is the tableaus. So these kind of frozen scenes, life-size figures, mannequins. There are dozens and dozens of these scenes that show different cultural, racial, ethnic groups, and they're often presented as sort of unfamiliar and exotic. They're framed in the same way as the specimen displays that you also see within the museum of taxidermy and skeletons and things like that. It's the transformation of people and their histories into objects of spectacle. Among the most famous of these is this scene, which shows the Lenape people, who are indigenous to the area around New York, meeting some of the Dutch arrivals that have come to found what becomes New York City. What the museum have tried to do in this case is, on the glass in front of the tableau, they've added little text boxes. You can probably just about see them in this image. They're very hard to see in real life as well as in the photographs. And to me, this is a huge problem because it doesn't actually give you any more information. It just points out the fact that the displays in the past were wrong and doesn't offer us any space to reconsider these stories and add more information, add more displays, change the types of displays that we have. I would recommend looking into this. If it's something that you're interested in, it's worth spending some time with the ways that this has been recontextualized and thinking about the ways that people have seen and re-seen these objects over time. But again, to me, this is a very clear example of where a museum is trying to recontextualize the objects that it holds. And fundamentally, the concern of museums is to maintain and preserve and conserve history. Museums are essentially, for the most part, static spaces. They're invested in their own survival, and they care more than anything about keeping those collections together and keeping them intact. Museum professionals and museum sort of official statements would disagree on that and point out the sort of work of education and interpretation that these collections do. But at their core, museums are boxes of things. And in their foundation, in their kind of creational intent, they are creating places where you can see the entirety of history pinned down and kept still. They're intended to be catalogues or encyclopedias of the world and all of its knowledge. And in many cases, the foundations of these museums are so deeply entangled within imperialism, within racism and colonialism, that it's impossible to break away from those histories. In the creation of an institution like a Natural History Museum or the British Museum, we have founders and collectors and individuals that are also very, very tightly tied to the history of eugenics, the kind of creation of hierarchies of race and racialization. It's important to note when we talk about these people that they see themselves as the sort of pinnacle of society. They see themselves as living in a golden age or an age of enlightenment. And it's important to understand the ways that these objects and these stories that they collect reflect their view of themselves. The creation of race as a category and the idea of race and racialization is very, very tightly enmeshed with the creation of museums. The idea is that you can define a culture or a period or a social group to its essential parts and put those parts on display. In the cataloging and invention of museums, you have immediately the creation of hierarchy and the idea that some things are more or less worthy than others. The groups that are creating these museums are making them in their own image. And overwhelmingly, they're people from a Northern European white Christian background. They have very similar educations. They have very similar sort of stories of family wealth. They're overwhelmingly men, and they create a world that reflects themselves. It's reasonable to me to say that museums in their invention are fundamentally white supremacist, because the individuals that are creating these spaces see themselves as supreme. They see themselves as the pinnacle, and they place everyone else beneath that. It's very difficult to reckon with that history and to challenge that history. It's very difficult to go back to your foundational myths and your foundational figures and really confront them in the way that you need to in order to address these stories more roundly and more empathetically. So the last two images I have here are by an artist called Ken Gonzalez Day. Gonzalez Day works primarily with photography as a medium, and one of his projects that these two images come from is taking photographs of lynchings and removing the body of the victim. It's very common in the 20th century for the deliberate kind of collective communal murder of particularly African American people, but also people of Latinx or Asian background in North America, to be the victims of a kind of like very aggressive, very violent form of crime. Lynching has a history of also being documented, and these images are circulated. They're turned into postcards. People take commemorative photographs to mark the fact that they were present at these scenes. These images are very widely archived. They are distressingly easy to find in many cases. It's not hard to find these photographs, these original images. Many museums have them on display. Many institutions keep them within their archives. What Gonzalez Day does with these images is he digitally alters them to remove the body of the victim of the murder. So what's left in these cases is a kind of void space where that body was. And what we see instead are the crowds of perpetrators. It's a way of reframing the focus of the scene. Instead of being about glorying in the death of an individual and the murder of an individual, it shows us the perpetrators. This is a really important thing that museums, I think, have a duty to do, and commemoration more broadly has a duty to do. We talk a lot in this country about the idea of Britain's sort of role in the slave trade being wiped away by the abolitionist movement, for example. That's important. The abolitionists did a big thing. But when you present it in that way, when you treat it in that way, what you're doing is dismissing the fact that to abolish something, you have to start it in the first place. And there are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are profiting from these acts of violence, that are perpetrating them and benefiting from them, and are reluctant to say goodbye to them. What Gonzalez Day does in these photographs is show us the space that's left. The victim is often the person who disappears within these stories. They're turned into archetypes. Sometimes we know their names, we know their histories, but for the most part, we sort of lose their individuality to this bigger story about the civil rights movement or the abolitionist movement or changes in cultural forms in the 18th and 19th centuries. We lose the individual. What happens in these images is that by removing the individual, we start to see the space that they've left behind. And we're able to focus in a very different way on the images that are being created and made by the violent acts themselves. There's a particular pressure here when we talk about the idea of death as a spectacle. And this is something that's a kind of core discussion and issue that's really central to the idea of Black Lives Matter as a political movement today. This idea of turning violence, turning murder, turning death into a spectacle. What I really want to emphasize by showing you these images by Ken Gonzalez Day is that this is not a new phenomenon. The idea of cell phone footage of someone being murdered by police is a direct descendant of these lynching photos that he is altering and adapting. This is something that it's important to consider because museums don't know how to deal with the historical precedent. The fact that galleries and archives and art institutions will frequently display these original unaltered photographs, often without necessarily giving a content warning for their visitors, is important, because then if we turn around and ask those same institutions to do justice to the histories of protest and resistance that we're seeing today, we're never going to find that adequately completed. We're never going to see those museums do a good enough job of it, because they still have this inherited baggage of their own colonial pasts before we can even get on to the contemporary issues that they're also supposed to be reflecting. On a much lighter note, I want to sort of leave with this image, because it's something I've seen circulating on social media, particularly on Facebook recently. I've seen a lot of people photoshopping the bodies of, in this case, Andrew Jackson, in other cases, Confederate soldiers or colonial military leaders out of their statues, just leaving the horses behind, with the idea that the horses did nothing wrong, so we can leave those statues and just get rid of the people. There's something quite charming and quite quirky about it, but it also gives us this very interesting aesthetic of what happens when you remove something, when you take away part of this story and what's left behind. It's a sort of slightly discordant note to end on, because one of the things that I really want to make clear to you is that museums are not equipped to be dealing with these stories yet. There are individuals and certain institutions that are doing their absolute best, and I have a huge amount of respect for them, but overwhelmingly, there's a real issue with confronting the past within these collections. When you ask a museum to take on a statue of a slave trader or a racist politician or something like that, for the most part, what you're doing is adding work to their burden when they've already shown that they're not capable of dealing with the burden that they already have. It's a deeply frustrating thing to me that we expect to sort of outsource our commemoration to monuments, and now to transfer that commemoration to museums and make it their problem and their responsibility. It is possible for museums to do justice to this history. It's something that some institutions are really taking on, but it's often done in a very temporary way or in a very short-sighted way that doesn't actually have any kind of longevity, that doesn't have a very deep connection to the communities that these institutions are trying to serve. It's also important to remember that these institutions that we're asking to do this work are themselves the products of imperialism. Museums as institutions are fundamentally created in the context of colonial history and colonial power. And asking them to represent these stories is asking them to try and fix their own problems, which to me is something that we have to expect will have to come from the outside to a certain extent. Activists and educators are a huge part of changing these spaces, and the current sort of protest landscape and artistic transformation that we're seeing of these objects is a really, really brilliant and important thing. But a lot of that energy and a lot of that work also needs to be happening within the institutions. You can't trust museums to do this for themselves. They've also got to be pushed and provoked in many cases to doing a better job of this kind of storytelling. I hope this was interesting. I want to leave you with an idea that comes from Amy Sazao, which is the idea that we are trying to understand the boomerang effect of colonialism, the idea that the perpetrators of these acts of violence are the ones that are most transformed by it. When you create your colonized subject as monstrous and strange and inhuman, what you are doing is in turn becoming that kind of inhuman, unethical, uncaring, very, very violent self. You are projecting all of your worst fears and insecurities onto another person, and in that process of projection, you are forcing them back onto yourself. Thank you, and I think we've got time for questions now, so I'm going to hand back over to Scott.
I believe we have. Thank you, Alice. That was great. Really enjoyed that. There's been a lot of really positive feedback. One person has asked, how can you be followed on social media, because they enjoyed your talk so much. So if you could just let us know where people can follow you and find you.
Yes, so my Twitter handle is AA Procter, Procter, with an E, not an O. And that's probably the best place to find me. Sometimes I'm also on Instagram as Alice A. Procter, but Twitter is where I live.
It's a fun place to live. There's been a couple of people just asking. Someone wanted to know the post, the Avine poster behind you. Someone wanted to know the artist of that.
Which one?
The bird poster, I think. Hang on.
This painting?
I believe so, yes.
This is by an Indigenous Australian artist called Angelina George, and her work is really, really beautiful. And yeah, this painting is far too big for my kitchen, but I love it too much to have it anywhere else.
There you go, anonymous Cindy. Angelina George. She's a Indigenous Australian artist.
Yes.
Brilliant. And someone else asked, I think when they were looking at one of the slides earlier on of the object that had scarring on it, and you were talking about the relevance of having scars and how scars are celebrated in some cultures. Somebody asked, what are we actually looking at in the image when you spoke in relation to scars and how they showed the caring that helped us go through the wound? They want to know what the big metal thing with the
Yes.
Hockney book in the bottom of the case, what it was.
Sorry, that wasn't hugely clear, that photograph. It's by Kader Attia, and in that case, it was a large metal disc, like a bowl, and he'd added these staples, like the kind of thing that you would use to staple a wound closed, which is what the scarring was. So it was made of metal, and it was meant to evoke the idea of trying to heal a wound, that there was a crack in the bowl.
Thank you. I'm just going to go through the questions. There's quite a lot. Look, Polly Russell wanted to hear your thoughts on the Colston statue and what should happen to it next.
Okay.
Lots of people didn't want to ask questions live, so
that's absolutely fine.
We're going to get some people up shortly, but it's my voice
now. So with the Colston statue, I personally loved the symbolism of dumping it in the water. There was a lot about that was very, very beautiful and very evocative, particularly as other critics and authors have said, the way that it almost imitated the deaths at sea of enslaved people in the transatlantic slave trade. That was very, very moving and very poignant. I believe in this case, it had to be removed for water pollution reasons, which is fair enough. But I know that the conservation teams at the Bristol museums are working really hard to ensure that they maintain the, for want of a better word, interventions that were put on it by protesters. So they are keeping the paint that was placed on it. They're keeping the sort of ropes and marks and that sort of thing. And they're trying really hard to make sure that they don't sort of wash that away and present it as if it's perfect and clean and ideal. So I think in this case, it will be really interesting. It will almost certainly go on display. I would have been quite happy to leave it in the water. I understand why that was not possible. But yeah, in this case, I think it will be cleaned up to some degree and almost certainly placed on display in a museum. Hopefully, there will be a reframing of that plinth and that space. There will be a new statue placed there or a new kind of atmosphere created around the place where that statue originally was.
Thanks, I'm going to try opening the microphone for Scorcher, who has a question. If you're there, Scorcher, it'd be nice to hear someone's voice apart from mine. Hello?
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 Why have I been unmuted? Sorry.
I'm sorry?
Why am I unmuted?
You had a question, and I thought you might want to ask that question.
Oh, yes. Hello. Hi. I was wondering, do you have any recommended reading on museums for former colonised countries? I am Irish, and I'm really interested in how we would deal with our colonised perspective in our museums that we've created and founded since our independence.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. There's some really interesting stuff here, I would say, in terms of, I'm familiar with the way that Irish history is being commemorated elsewhere in the world, particularly in connection to former colonies. So there's some very interesting stuff about how Irish colonialism and the displacement of Irish people has been sort of inherited in Australia, and the way that you see this history of a subjugated and colonized people then going to sort of reenact that subjugation on another culture. I know that there's been some really interesting work recently looking at how we commemorate histories of violence around the Troubles and that sort of thing. I don't have any books off the top of my head, but I would be very, very happy to try and find some for you if that's something that I can help with. It's a really important and really interesting story.
It's very interesting because our independence is coming up for a centenary next year.
Yeah.
And I've been looking at museums in my own local area because I'm in Dublin, and how we're looking at our own history and how we deal with it, because it is complicated. We were subjugated and then turned around, and especially Irish Americans then went over to America and just played out their colonial history on other people. It's complicated, and we have to hold both of those things in our stories.
Yeah, absolutely. I also know that in some cases, a lot of objects from other colonies end up in Irish museums. So there are significant collections from, as you say, North America, also from Australia and the South Pacific, where people are acquiring these objects in whatever circumstances and sending them home to the museums. So the museums then have this situation where they have to try and display these objects in a way that's kind of considerate and inclusive, whilst also trying to reckon with their own histories. I'm also really looking forward to seeing what museums do around this centenary. I think it's going to be fascinating and hopefully galvanizing for a lot of these institutions.
Thanks, Scorcher. I think Peter Morgan, your microphone's open as well. You had a question?
Yes, I visit a lot of museums in Western Europe. Most of these are still under the authority of the state or local authority. An awful lot of rebuilding has gone on in European cities of their museums. The best example, perhaps the worst, is the African Museum at Tervuren on the edge of Brussels, which has done a major rebuild and has tackled one or two of the issues of being a document of the awful way in which the Belgians treated the Congo. But in this country, of course, the state has largely abandoned our museum sector, encouraged them to become charities. And I wonder how, particularly in the present moment, how a lot of these issues are to be addressed when the money simply isn't there. The same might also be said, of course, of the National Trust and many of the properties which they have built on the profits of slavery.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. That's a really great question. We have this very different type of dynamic here because we don't have the same sort of state oversight of museums. The National Trust are currently doing their best with their colonial history collections. They've been working for the last couple of years towards having new programs, new representation, that sort of thing. It's been a slow process. It's been a little uneven in places, but the intention is there. Intention is not the same as outcome, but they're doing some good work, which is great. This is something that I find really tricky because while I really support the idea of changing curriculums and changing, school systems and that sort of thing, there's been a lot of emphasis recently on the idea of petitioning the government to get them to include colonial history in school curriculums. I think when we focus entirely on the idea of museums and educational institutions as the places that need to change, it's a way of sort of shifting some of the responsibility off of us. You're never going to be able to get the complete history of the world in your GCSE history classes, and you're never going to get that in museums as well. These institutions are frequently unwilling to change, and it's very hard to pressure them. As visitors, we have power. The fact that they are not as tightly controlled by the government means that they do have some flexibility. They could respond to these questions and these issues. Often it's a case of choosing not to do that. There's a really frustrating dynamic here where museums aren't perfect, but they're kind of the best that we have right now. I find the disconnect between the government and the museums to be quite a fertile space to be. There is more opportunity, more flexibility for these institutions. And that's something that you particularly see outside of London. It's also true that sometimes the opposite is true. Local authority museums that do still have a connection to local government, councils and that sort of thing, often have a different pressure to serve their local community. And therefore they've got a different type of structure where they're much more driven to respond to the needs and demographics of the people that live around them. So it can work both ways. I think ultimately, the thing I would really suggest is that we stop relying on museums to be our sole source of these histories and these stories. Similarly, stop relying on universities and governments and schools to do all of that work. It's very tricky. Thank you for bringing it up. It's an important thing to keep in mind that there is a level of overall state control that goes into a lot of these institutions.
Hello?
No, thank you for that previous question. Our next person is Anita, sister in the Raw Mackenzie, who has a question.
Okay. Hi. I wanted to go back to what you were saying about the statue. So what I'm interested in about that is that the whole thing around kind of like statues commemorating one thing or another, and that the kind of like the issue of economics around that, and there being a continuum of violence from the point at which any of them are erected to where we are now. That violence hasn't ended, and there's a daily diet of the images that we're seeing on social media, particularly of documenting the violence towards people of color. So given that that's the context, in the current context meeting the historical context, and the fact that people still think in terms of spending money, or the government or the Arts Council, whatever, investing in creating statues for one event or another, because I saw recently in the last 2 weeks about more statues to commemorate Windrush. And I'm wondering, with the economic disparities within the community of colour, whether or not that should be something that we kind of like, that we need to do or want to do it at this moment in time. And I wanted to ask you, what do you believe should happen to all these types of statues that are already existing? Because I mean, people are, a lot of us are already taking that into our own hands, but you might have answered this earlier in your presentation, but I wasn't able to be here from the beginning. So there's a lot of them all over the country. I live outside London, and there's lots of reminders of the colonial past. And I live in what is traditionally a UKIP area, where it's very unsafe on some levels to be out there, to be openly out there. There's a lot of patriotism in the area that I live in relation to kind of like, the First World War and the Second World War, because it is a military zone, that's how I think of it. And not that those things shouldn't be commemorated, but in the commemoration, when I look at these things, that's what comes to me, the continuum of violence, which is happening today as we speak.
Absolutely. And the phrasing of that as a continuum of violence is a really, really important thing to draw out, this idea that actually it is a legacy, and it's something that's still very, very deeply felt. It's inherited, it's passed down, and it's ongoing. And all of us are living within this kind of continuum. It's closer to the surface for some people than for others. And that comes down to how you are socialized and how you kind of experience the way that you live within the world. Thank you so much for bringing this up. I find it there's obviously, I have to give the sort of disclaimer of all statues need to be considered on their own terms, but I think this point that you're making about the fact that statues tend to only commemorate like a single event or a single figure is a really important one. Statues are simplistic. They minimize the context, they minimize the story that's going on behind us. They really shrink everything down to this idea that it can be sort of encapsulated in a single physical unchanging form. And that's fundamentally not possible. It's also not very healthy or helpful to get kind of wedded to this idea that we have this one physical object that we see and it tells us all that we need to know. I would also really like to emphasize that statues are never intended to be universal. Statues are always something that is created or displayed to create and polarize communities. The idea of public commemoration, any form of public memorialization, is that it creates an in-group who identify with that history and an out-group that are separate from it. These figures and these visual forms are intended to be kind of lightning rods of nationalism and patriotism. So when a statue or a memorial kind of galvanizes in the way that you're describing, this like UKIP mob or whatever, that's a sign that the statue is doing what it was designed to do. It's really important to keep in mind that these statues are not meant to be inclusive or complete or welcoming to everybody. They are intended to create and divide categories and boundaries. That's why I don't think many of these statues sort of serve us or continue to serve the community at large. I think your point about the fact that this government has a bit of a tendency to say, we'll just put up a monument and then the problems are solved is a really important one as well. This idea that we'll just add more statues to commemorate the Windrush, whereas there's still no compensation for people that were deported or threatened with deportation in the last couple of years. You know, that's absurd. It's kind of obscene to suggest that the most important thing is having a new monument or a new statue rather than actually addressing how these stories are lived today. it's deeply frustrating, this kind of reliance on commemoration as a closed and complete thing. And I think that in many cases, the best thing is to take it into your own hands. Not that I would ever encourage anyone to do anything violent or destructive, but in some cases, it's very important to understand that commemoration is the responsibility of the general public. Commemoration and how we tell these stories is up to us. We can see these objects and we can reconsider them and reframe them continually. And we need to learn to recognize their incompleteness, if that makes sense. You had such a brilliant and deep and rich question, and I hope I've done some justice to what you were saying in answer to this, but yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. Let us know in the Q&A if you'd like to know more. Next, have Leah Wild. He's got a practical question, which I quite like.
Hello. Big fan of your work. I really liked it when you came and spoke at the Fitzwilliam Museum Society last year. So I sort of now have a question, which is, asking for sort of practical advice and guidance. I now work at a college in Cambridge, which is looking to take down a stained glass window commemorating the eugenicist R.A. Fisher. Sort of recently, the college has recently agreed to do this, which I think is a really great step in the right direction. But they haven't agreed what they want to do with it, how they want to take it down, how, if it does get taken down, what's going to happen to it? Is it just going to get put into the archives, or are we going to replace it with something else? And I just kind of wanted to ask your opinion. If you were in this position with the ability to recommend something, what would you say we should do with it?
Oh boy, okay, thank you. Part of me is very invested in the idea of like a symbolic smashing, but I understand that's not how these things work. I would also say it's very important that these objects don't just disappear. I don't support or believe in the argument that if you remove a statue, you forget that history, but I think it's very easy when you have an institution and a college in this case to remove it, put something else in its place, and pretend that never happened. You know, it's very easy to brush these things away. Something I would really encourage the college to do in this case is to leave that space for a while. If you can remove the window safely and create a kind of void that leaves this room, leaves space to encourage people to think about this history and the legacies of it, that can be incredibly evocative. It's not something that always works in museums because empty display cases aren't very visually interesting, and with museum spaces we're often thinking about what will get an audience in. But maybe in this case, if it's a physical part of a building, the idea of leaving a fragment, leaving an empty space, is something that can challenge the way that we see these stories and tell these stories, and it can encourage people to sort of sit with the absence that this figure in this case has been involved in an incredibly violent history. And in his involvement in that history, he has destroyed and erased the lives and existence of others. I personally quite like the idea of sometimes leaving room for that kind of discomfort and that kind of commemoration. It may not be practical in this case, that's my personal sort of wish for these types of works. And then you decide what archive they go into, what you do with them, you melt them down and recycle them, or whatever you end up doing. But there needs to be space to kind of sit with this and to let that history breathe before you immediately sub in something else.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for that question. Just to let everyone know, we do not have time for all of the questions coming in. There's some really, sorry, that's my next meeting. We do not have time for all the questions coming in. Alice, are you okay to talk for another 10 minutes and answer another couple of questions?
Yeah, I'm really happy to do that. And if I don't get to your question now, probably the best thing to do is to @ me on Twitter if you can, or send me an email and I will try and answer them.
Yeah, it's already been asked if it's okay to do that, and I'm really glad it is. The next question is from Joy. Joy, your microphone should be open.
Yes, hello. Is this coming through?
Yes.
It is.
Fantastic. Alice, I'd love to ask you about your role specifically as a tour guide, and if you have any advice or ideas for bringing these ideas outside of more academic museum spaces into the mainstream role of tourism. And I ask this because I work as a tour guide, and there's been a lot of pushback in the last couple of months from professional organisations when they've been approached about integrating more honest narratives when it comes to parts of these history. And so I live in Scotland, and a very common tour is coming from Inverness and travelling down the country and finishing in Edinburgh or Glasgow. And you start off in Inverness, you visit battlefields like Culloden, you might travel through Glencoe and talk about war crimes and massacres there. And then you get into Edinburgh and you go, oh, there's Henry Dundas at the top of the tallest pillar. Or you get into Edinburgh and see Henry Dundas, or you get into Glasgow and you're talking about the tobacco barons and all of the entrepreneurial work that they did improving things in the city, as opposed to the terrible things happening overseas. And sort of questioning that is met with, oh, but visitors on holiday don't want to think about that. And you know, you're going to have very diverse audiences, and you don't want to upset them on their holidays, which is something that just fills me with rage.
Yeah, it also fills me with rage. If you want to talk sort of professionally in private as well, I'm always very, very happy to talk about this with any other tour guides that might be here as well. This is something that I've worked as an official guide in some capacities, as well as the independent work that I do now. So I have some experience with navigating that, and I'm always happy to try and sort of on a much more practical level, try and help come up with ways to talk to these sort of professional bodies and that kind of thing. So if that's a kind of open invitation to anyone who's an educator or tour guide that might need this kind of discussion. It's really hard to push back in this kind of space. I would say one of the reasons that I work with tour guiding is because it can be so conversational and it can be so reciprocal and creative, and I find that really rewarding. I obviously, working as an independent guide, there's a sense to which everyone has sort of signed up to have an uncomfortable conversation. You know what you're getting when you come on a tour with me. And that's different to the way that we can try and sort of sneak these things into other spaces. I would say it's really important to encourage audiences on any guided tour to think about how these stories might have been commemorated. The Dundas question is a great opportunity for this. Talk about how he has been displayed and represented over time, talk about the different kind of political interpretations of some of these figures, and try and understand the contemporary legacies of these people. It's often very useful when you have a statue or a monument to talk about the time that passes between the death of that figure and their public commemoration, because often a lot has changed within that space. You know, things have moved, things have been transformed. There's a kind of political shuffling that's going on that creates these monuments as well. On a practical level, I feel like the thing to get really good at is sort of dropping hints so that members of your group are then more kind of able to ask those difficult questions if they want them. It's very tricky when you work with institutions, and I would include a tour guiding organization as an institution in this case, because there's this real fear of alienating your visitors. I have had conversations with museum professionals where they've explained to me that they won't be including information about the history of the slave trade in their galleries because they're worried about upsetting their regular audiences. I think if you as a person in 2020 are going to museums and you're going to be upset by the fact that there are references to enslavement in these galleries, you need to take a very long look at yourself. But one of the things that you can do is this sort of almost drip feeding of information. If you've ever worked with children, you'll be familiar with this approach, but the idea that you sort of let them realize that there are questions that they don't have the answers to. You can do it very subtly. It's like a little bit of a mind control thing as a tour guide, that you're shifting people and taking them on this kind of emotional journey to having these questions and having these conversations. And I think that's why I love doing the work that I do, is that it enables you to help people come to their own realizations. You know, you can bombard people with facts about these histories, but ultimately it will be more effective if you help them realize things for themselves. I hope that's useful to you. I hope that's encouraging in some way. But I would really encourage you to sort of gently push people towards these conversations and these questions for themselves wherever you possibly can.
Alice, that's answered a couple of other questions that are in the Q&A as well. So I'm going to do 2 more questions if that's okay. This next one from Bal Ravachlia. I'm really sorry to pronounce your name, and then we'll wrap up a few questions together to ask. So, Bal, are you there?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm part of the question that I asked in writing, I think you've sort of answered already in other ways. But I'm interested in this idea that museums are fundamentally flawed as structures, as institutions. And as a museum worker myself, I do feel that kind of issue very much on my skin as being part of the problem and how not to be anymore. But at the same time, I do care for material culture and the role that material culture can have as a tool for education. And so to talk about monuments from the point of view of the ideological role that they serve is one thing. But then there's the aspect of what to do with certain objects as a remainder of a culture that produced them. So for example, the fact that statues of slavers and Confederate generals were created, by the way, not coeval to the events, but afterwards as commemorations of people that were really nostalgic of the Confederacy. So there's an interest in telling the story of why the hell would anyone in the 1930s want to build a statue to a Confederate general. Having said that, it doesn't need to stay on the pedestal where it is and be glorified. And that recontextualization is important. But at the same time, if the museum is a fundamentally flawed structure and is not fit for the purpose of doing that recontextualization, is there something else that maybe isn't called a museum but serves the purpose of telling stories through material culture?
Yeah. This is so tricky. Thank you for this question. I know a lot of people are really into the idea of statue graveyards at the moment. That's always been a big thing in former Soviet countries. The idea that you have like your little like park where you just dump all of the statues that you don't have on display anymore. I think that's kind of fun, but there's a danger that it becomes sort of very touristy and very theme parky, and you're not actually getting any information about that. You're just going for the sort of weird aesthetics of it. It becomes a backdrop rather than a kind of historical experience. I also fully agree that like we need to have this sort of conservation approach in mind. When I talk about the idea that museums are sort of not fit for purpose, I say this because I want them to be better. I think one of the things that would make a huge difference to the way that these museums function is a greater level of self-awareness and a kind of more reflexive narrative within those spaces. You need to include the idea that you are flawed. You need to address that. It's the sort of first step of acknowledging that you have a problem before you go straight into trying to sort of solve that problem. You need to, again, as with Lee's question, you need to sort of sit with the discomfort for a while, and you need to sort of spend some time with the fact that this is flawed, this is damaging, this is harmful. In terms of how I think museums can do that better, I would encourage them to look at the objects they already have in their collections before they try and take on any more. But I would also encourage people to understand that not every object has to last forever. We're very invested in the way that museums and their collections are supposed to be sort of permanent or static in some way. Sometimes decay is good. Sometimes the loss of an object is actually sort of cathartic and can be part of a healing process. Not everything has to be preserved forever. And I think in the case of Confederate monuments and some of the statues that we've been talking about, we don't need to keep every single one of them. We have images of them, we have stories of them, we have their cultural and material contexts. We don't need the physical objects themselves if we've got, you know, information from the artists and other documents and that sort of thing. So on a practical level, that's a way of saving space in these institutions. But I also think that sometimes just having the object on display can be very boring and can be very tame. If we talk around those objects without necessarily sort of revering the physical thing as the ultimate sort of embodiment of history, we have more interesting conversations and we have more productive conversations, because we have to think about the way that these physical statues in this case, or individuals, how their histories sort of ripple down to us. when we don't see the statue, but we see everything that takes place around it, we can think about how that statue is sort of culturally created rather than immediately sort of pinning ourselves to its material existence, if that makes sense. I have a lot of very messy thoughts about this, and it's one of those things where I feel like I change my mind every 5 minutes, depending on what statue is currently under discussion. But personally, I don't think that the statue graveyards are a great solution. And I would really encourage museums and art spaces to think a bit more creatively about how they conserve these histories, how they keep these objects, and narratively engage with them. It doesn't have to be a room full of statues, you know?
Last question, which is from Laura Garner. She's encapsulated a number of questions that have been coming in the Q&A and the chat, so that's why I picked on her, but also people like Hannah Salisbury, Akshi, Marianne and Claire in the chat have been asking about institutions who are doing well and how people can influence institutions, activists, to improve their practice. So over to you, Laura.
Hi Alice, yeah, this has been really amazing, thank you so much. Yeah, that was basically my question really, like what institutions should we be looking to if you want to see best practice in terms of dealing with colonialist histories in museums and galleries? And also, yeah, are there any particular activists or groups that we should look at for inspiration in terms of alternative approaches, whether that's sort of, you've mentioned loads of artists, but also, yeah, pressure groups.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. It's really hard to pick on any individual museums that I think are doing a good job, because often it's the work of 1 or 2 members of staff or even a temporary exhibition, and I don't want to give the institution credit for those individuals. I think that some of the most interesting examples we see do currently come in the form of temporary exhibitions and temporary interventions, and it's unfortunate that there's often not a lot of longevity to that. The example that everyone currently wheels out is The Past Is Now in Birmingham, which was a fantastic exhibition. It was a really interesting way of engaging with these histories. It was one tiny room, it was temporary, and it was led by volunteers. So there was a lot of problems with the way that that installation happened. I would encourage you to read work by Rachel Minot and Samaya Kasim, kind of unpacking what happened during and after that exhibition. There's a lot of information out there about how The Past Is Now was sort of created and presented. So that's a great place to start. There's an incredible resource that was sort of compiled by Latanya Autry, who's one of the leaders of the Museums Are Not Neutral campaign, which is a social justice and museums reading list. It's like a 400-page long Google Doc of every possible thing you could ever need. And it's really, really brilliant and very overwhelming. So I would recommend that if this is something that you want to get into, that's a fantastic place to start. I'm a huge fan of the work that's currently being done by activists as pressuring institutions. I think artists are often really great at this, but frequently they're more invested in collaborating with the institution than really confronting it. Whereas an activist group can create something different and more engaging if they don't have the same sort of, necessarily the same aesthetic goals in mind. For that, I would recommend all of the Art Not Oil groups, which included originally Liberate Tate and BP or Not BP, and has sort of shifted in its origins and understanding. If you look up Art Not Oil and Culture Unstained, there's a lot of really great work happening there. Similarly, there's work led by Nan Golding about the Sackler sponsorship of galleries and the way that opioids and pharmaceuticals then become part of the sort of cultural power of institutions. My absolute favorites are Decolonize This Place, because they don't just do museums, they do everything. And their work at the moment is really focused on police brutality and violence in America. They organize social actions around Black Lives Matter and other protests, including like policing on the subway in New York, but they were also part of the group that really led the campaign against the Roosevelt statue at the Natural History Museum, and they were instrumental in the removal of Warren Kanders from the board of the Whitney Museum. So that's probably my favorite kind of place to keep an eye out. There's lots going on, and there are individual members of staff that do amazing things. Museum Detox as an organization is really, really brilliant, and some of their staff are, like, not staff, some of their members are the most impressive and most transformative museum workers that are currently sort of coming up in the sector, and that's been a really beautiful place to see this kind of generation. Similarly, Museum as Muck is doing something amazing with advocacy for working class and people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds trying to work in the museum sector. There's a lot going on, and you can find something to cover literally anything. But those are some of my favorites. I hope that's kind of useful. And yeah, look at your local museum. Find out what the closest, smallest museum to you is doing, because often that's the best place to start change. If you go to somewhere that's very community focused, they have different needs and different desires. The Horniman Museum in outer South London has just announced that they're going to essentially hire and pay consultants, which is groundbreaking for museums that so frequently rely on volunteer labor to change their displays. So that's a really exciting opportunity. They're looking for people of Afro-Caribbean backgrounds and Black British backgrounds to help consult on the way that they're changing their displays. And that's really, really brilliant that they're actually sort of giving a professional responsibility to people. That was just a list of people that I think are doing interesting work. But there's a lot to find if you want to keep digging throughout these histories and throughout these objects. So I've just seen people asking me to repeat the names of some of these things. I would look up The Past Is Now, and if you look that up, you'll find an article called The Museum Will Not Be Decolonized, which is by Samaya Kasim. You'll also find work by Rachel Minot, who worked on sort of was involved in The Past Is Now and worked on like unpicking that. And the reading list is called Museums and Social Justice. So that's a really great thing to look out for. And the compiler of that is also involved in the Museums Are Not Neutral sort of hashtag, which is another great place to try and find more information. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. That was a brilliant talk. Thank you very much. It has been recorded and will be on the Conway Hall YouTube channel in due course. We've got a bit of a backlog. Really inspiring talk. It's the sort of thing we try and do here, and I apologise to everyone who didn't get their question asked. Alice will be on social media and you can get your questions in there. Thank you very much for everyone. Thank you, Alice. Conway Hall will be back in 2 weeks on a talk about blasphemy history. And then in 4 weeks' time, a talk on how to be a loser and still live a good life. Slightly more philosophical talk. Then I think we're taking a break and returning back in September, probably still in the substitute shed and not in Conway Hall itself. So thank you very much, everyone. Going to put a quick slide up. Thank you again, Alice. I'm going to get back to our. Please donate to us if you haven't. There's a link at the bottom. And thanks, Alice, and thank you to everyone who came along. I said thank you a lot, but I think I should. Take care out there. We hope to see you again soon, and thank you for attending. Bye-bye. Thank you, Alice.